Well, friends, I feel bad that I was going to say something about the average age in the audience increasing when the youth and the children left. You know, I was looking around and I saw so many friends. I remember when Van Gilmer and I had hair. And I remember when Eric Dozier's beard wasn't there, and it certainly wasn't gray. I remember when Chuck George had hair and still made the best fruitcake in Illinois. It is so wonderful to be back. We all feel the same way about this special place because these are days that are precious in our hearts. And we come here and we feel like a tea bag that has been soaked in love. Don't you feel that way? And I remember when I first came to Green Lake and my kids were little, and my primary concern was, what are they doing? And can I get them before they break something? And now my kids have kids, and life goes on. So I want to make just a couple of introductory remarks about this weekend. First of all, I want to say to Shadi how beautiful her music is. And I want to reflect on the arc of our development musically, because we've really gone from nothing to something. Listen, I'm not denigrating the past. I'm just a witness. When I was in Bahá'í School as a Baha'i child, the entire musical repertoire of kids was "Good morning, sun, good morning, sun. The night is done, the day's begun." Or, consultation means finding out what everybody is talking about. And if you really wanted to go out on a musical limb, we sang "Johnny is a Christian, Jacob is a Jew, Ali is Muhammad, and here's what they can do." They can learn to live together. This is way before the core curriculum or Ruhi Book 3 or any kind of musical coherence in our community, but we loved it. Now, those were the days when you went to Bahá'í School and you sat next to your parents and you listened to whoever the speaker was for that Sunday morning. And if you acted out, you went to heaven early. The rules were clear, we all understood them, we all complied. But friends, I wanted to say just a couple of things in introducing the idea of hope in the family. And I wanted to just share that in my own family, there has been significant change just in the last few months. In the period from March through mid-April, we lost 4 of our family members. And it was overwhelming. Because, these people are the most wonderful human beings we know. And they've loved us, and we've loved them, and they saw special things in us. And we hoped to become what they saw. And we took for granted, because of their longevity and because of their spiritual prosperity and their God-given health, that they would just be with us always. And then to suddenly find that one after another in rapid succession is being called home is a moment of profound reflection for us, because it causes us to remember all the things that are most important about life. So as we think about hope in the family, and as we think about this in the context of these particularly troubling times, I'd like to make a couple of comments about my own family and its relationship to hope and faith. I remember as a child, and I was probably somewhere between 3 and 4. Probably wasn't 3, but wasn't 4 yet either. And I knew two prayers. I knew, "O God, guide me, protect me, illumine the lamp of my heart, and make me a brilliant star." And I knew, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." And I remember as if it was yesterday, lying in my bed every night, and I would thank God for being God. I was 3.5. These were not sophisticated concepts. But I would thank God for being God, and I would thank him for Baha'u'llah. And I would thank him for the Bab, and I would thank him for Abdu'l-Baha, and I would thank him for Shoghi Effendi. And then I would thank him for my grandmother and my grandfather. Because in my eyes and in my heart, my grandparents were the finest human beings I knew. And I thought then, and I think now, that if I could live and be like them, then my life would not have been in vain. It would have been a good life. And it would have been a life that was faithful and obedient to the purpose of creation. I remember my grandmother telling me the story of how she found the Baha'i faith. Now, this was in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, my family was Baptist. My mother was a little girl. She had 6 surviving siblings. And my grandmother found the faith, and at the time, she was the founding and organizing member of the Baptist church in her community. And for black people in the 30s, the church was everything. It was your social circle, it was your political organization, it was your economic foundation, it was your friendship network, it was everything. It was your health care. I'll tell you that when, during that time, my mother was playing jacks by an incinerator, and a spark caught her dress. And she was burned severely from her knees to her chin, so much so that there was no skin. And at that time, the hospitals did not accept black patients. So here is a child of 6 years old who is on the doorstep of death, and there was no place to go. And it was the church that went and pleaded with the president of the hospital to let this black girl in the hospital to be treated. And for the next 6 years, they pieced her skin back together so that she could be alive and have a good life. But that's how central the church was. Now, my grandmother was taught the Baha'i faith by a 17-year-old white Baha'i youth named Johnny Eichenhauer. Now, just picture this. Because my grandmother was a formidable woman. Everybody knew Sadie Ellis, and everybody respected her, and she was as strong as her name implies. And every Saturday, skinny little Johnny Eichenhauer would come to the back door of my grandmother's house, and he would knock on the door and he would say, "Mrs. Ellis, can I tell you about the Baha'i faith today?" And she would say, "Hi, Johnny, good to see you." "No. But you can come in and have some pie, and I'll give you some lemonade." And so every Sunday, or every Saturday, Johnny would come back. And he would knock on the door, and the scene would repeat itself. And then as circumstance would have it, my grandmother was in a reflective mood one day, and she remembered an encouragement that her father had given her before he died. He said to her that he believed that it was time for Christ to return. And he believed that when he returned, he would return as a thief in the night, just as he had promised. And he believed that people would be too caught up in their lives and their affairs and their confidence in faith to investigate the claim of the new messenger, the world redeemer, the Father that God had promised over time. And he asked her to promise him before he passed away that if she should hear of a new religion, she would investigate the new religion, and she would use the criterion that Christ gave us: ye shall know them by their fruits, to determine the truth of the new claim. And so one day, Johnny Eisenhower came to the back door on a Saturday, and he said, "Mrs. Ellis, can I tell you about the Baha'i faith today?" And she said, "Sit down, have some pie and some lemonade, and tell me about your faith." And that was the beginning of her spiritual journey. Now, it happens that I have had the privilege of seeing the letter of her enrollment dated way back in 1937. And it was a letter from the local Spiritual Assembly of Los Angeles, and it said, it was to Horace Holly, then Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly, and it said, "Dear Mr. Holly, this letter is to introduce Sadie Rebecca Ellis to the National Spiritual Assembly." And it said that she had read the Gleanings, and she had read this book, and she had read that book, and she had demonstrated her knowledge, and it requested that she be admitted to the Baha'i faith. And Horace wrote back to the local assembly, and it said, because Sadie Rebecca Ellis has demonstrated her knowledge of the fundamental teachings and this and that and the other, she is accepted as a member of the Baha'i faith. And so when my grandmother became a Baha'i, one week, all of her kids went to Baptist Sunday school, and the next week, all of her kids went to Baha'i Sunday school. And of course, because of the close-knit nature of the congregation that she had come from, there was a great upset about her change of faith. People didn't understand it. They were afraid of it. And so the pastor came to her house, and he knocked on the door, and he said, "Sister Ellis, I've just come to retrieve you to the arms of Christ." And she greeted him with respect and with love. And as she showed him the door, she said to him, "If you knew Christ, you would know Baha'u'llah." And that was the beginning of our family's spiritual life as Baha'is. And so years passed, and by the time I came along, everybody I knew was Baha'i. All of my relatives, my cousins, when we went to Baha'i School on Sunday, it was a group. We're probably this wing of the auditorium. Cousins, sisters, aunts, uncles, my grandparents, my mother, and the rule was still the same. It was always the same. Sit next to your mother. Don't move. And God forbid that you should speak out of turn or make noise. Consequences would surely follow. That was before we discovered the concept of child abuse. You remember those days. I can't be the only one who suffered the lash or who had to go break a twig off a tree. Longest walk of your young life, I've got to tell you. But then I would go to school and just consider the circumstances. You know, when I came up, we lived in South Central Los Angeles, which was then and is now the largest geographic ghetto in the continental United States. So there were black people for miles and miles, and nobody else. And then on Sundays, I would go to Baha'i School, and I knew everybody. I knew Asian people and Latinos, and I knew American Indians, and I knew Persians, and I knew whites and blacks, and it was a completely different reality. And everybody was talking about the very complex concepts of the Baha'i faith, the teachings of Baha'u'llah, and the demonstration of those teachings by Abdu'l-Baha, and the interpretation of those teachings by Shoghi Effendi. And they talked about Shoghi Effendi especially with such love and such reverence that the spirit of it caught my young heart. Now, I didn't understand who Shoghi Effendi was, and I didn't understand that he was the head of the Baha'i faith and the grandson of Abdu'l-Baha. But they talked about him with such affection that I believed he must be one of them, because there was such an intimate quality in the way they described him. And I thought to myself, well, who is this Shoghi Effendi that everybody talks about so dearly? And they kept describing him as the beloved gardener. Now, they were saying guardian, but that was not in my vocabulary. I was 4 years old, or 5 or 6, but it didn't matter. I was young, and they would say, Shoghi Effendi, the beloved guardian, and I would think, oh, they're talking about a gardener. And I would think to myself, aren't these people wonderful? Look at the love they have for the gardener. And they talk about him like he's with them right here. But then they also talked about Shoghi Effendi in the Holy Land. And at that point, we had seen pictures of the Holy Land and the Shrine of the Bab and the gardens and so on. And I thought to myself, so Shoghi Effendi takes care of those gardens, and then he takes care of the gardens here. And everybody really loves him. He must be a wonderful gardener. And I thought to myself, you know, these Baha'is are so great. They're all different colors, and every one of them greets me with a smile and with encouragement and with genuine affection. And friends, you know, the truth of the matter is, we didn't have sophisticated Baha'i classes for kids. We certainly didn't have things that kids could go to. And I really didn't understand the things that were being discussed at the podium. But here's what I knew. I knew that when I went to Bahá'í School, all those people cared for me, that I mattered to them, that they were all different colors and cultures, and yet the sense of love and affection and spiritual kinship was there. And so before I understood anything about the teachings, I understood something about the spirit of the faith, and the spirit of the faith was manifest in the love I felt among the friends. And that was just personified by their constant references to the things that the beloved gardener Shoghi Effendi had said. And so, as kids aren't wont to do, I tried to figure out just how it is that Shoghi Effendi could keep the gardens here and keep the gardens in Haifa, and I never saw him, and I'm here every week. And of course, I came to an answer which I was quite comfortable with for many years to come. I concluded that the pictures I had seen of the gardens in Haifa, the gardens were vast, and they were very complicated. So I naturally assumed that he spent most of his time in Haifa because there was more work to do. And of course, the gardens in front of the New Hampshire Avenue Baha'i Center in Los Angeles were tiny. You know, this is an urban area. You had a little patch of grass and some trees and some flowers, and they were all nicely kept. But I figured that, you know, even in my young mind, I figured 2 hours tops. And so the solution that I came to, the understanding that I came to was that Shoghi Effendi was in Haifa most of the week. He would fly to Los Angeles, probably on a Wednesday, because I wasn't there on Wednesdays. And he would take care of, tidy up the grass and the trees and the gardens and so forth, 2 hours tops. And then, devoted soul that he is, he would fly back to Haifa and renew his labors on the gardens there. And I was happy with that explanation for a very long time. I got to tell you what's true. But here's the point that I wanted to make about this. You know, we started this evening with that beautiful hidden word, O Son of Spirit, possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. The thematic message of that hidden word is for us to fill our hearts with love and kindness as the first counsel of the messenger of God to us. But have we ever asked ourselves what he means by sovereignty? That thine may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, everlasting. I wonder if there isn't a clue in the second hidden word, where he says, O Son of Spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. For by its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not of the knowledge of thy neighbors. And I wonder if the sovereignty that Baha'u'llah is referring to in the first hidden word is that we would be of independent mind, that we would know of our own knowledge and not of the knowledge of others, that we would see with our own eyes and not with the eyes of our neighbors, and that what we would see is God's love for us and the purpose of our creation. What does he say? Veiled in my immemorial being, and in the ancient eternity of mine essence, I knew my love for thee. Therefore I created thee, engraved upon thee mine image, and revealed to thee my beauty. And I'm wondering, friends, if the task that has been set before us by Baha'u'llah is to create ourselves and our families and our community and our nation and our world equipped with that kind of kindliness and radiance, that kind of sovereignty, that kind of confidence in the independence of mind, the application of spiritual principles to circumstances to unravel our complicated problems. Remember that Abdu'l-Baha told us that the happiness and greatness, the rank and station, the pleasure and peace of a human being would not depend on social status or material attainment, but on the scope of their learning, on the refinement of their character, and on their ability to solve difficult problems. Isn't this the simple means by which Baha'u'llah has given us to accomplish those very things? So I'd like to leave you with this idea. The Bible tells us that the kingdom of heaven is within. And Abdu'l-Baha tells us that the family is the nucleus of civilization itself. And so might it make sense that our fundamental task is to recreate the kingdom of heaven on earth, first in our own hearts, and then in our families, that it might radiate a transformational influence over the families in your neighborhood, and the people in your community, and the communities in your state, and the states in your nation, and the nations in your world. That's what we're here to talk about. Good morning. Somebody asked me if I slept well last night, but I honestly can't remember. Is that an age thing? Seriously. Now, I'll tell you what is an age thing. I came up on the stage with the wrong glasses on. You know, they're okay for reading, but from the distance between me and my notes, I'll never see them. So we're going to do a little quick change here. All of us of a certain age know that time and technology has not been our friend. Somebody asked me this morning what I call this. And apparently it was a litmus test for whether I was a modern guy or, what do I call it? Do I call it a purse or a man bag or, what is it? And I said, look, time and technology has done me in. And in the old days, guys know, in the old days we had a wallet and keys, that was it. And so all you needed was a pocket. Now we've got cell phones and mini tablets and 2 different kinds of pens and a highlighter because you've got to underline stuff. And how are you going to put that in your pockets? So somebody invented these. Thank you. I appreciate it. Lord have mercy. I saw a young boy. He probably was 7, 8 years old. And it was just as I drove up. And I went into the restroom, and this kid was in there, and he was washing his hands. And I asked him, I said, how come you're not at dinner? He said, oh, no, I've got my dinner out there. He said, and I had a plan. I said, really? What was your plan? He said, well, I saw everybody going for the food, so I went for the dessert first. He said, because when they're done with the food, they're all going to descend on the dessert. And I wanted to make sure I had mine squared away. And I thought to myself, I like this guy. And then I thought to myself, I may be this guy. See, we've got it all wrong about systematization. We always talk about we want to systematize everything. We're building a divine system, we're building a system of life, and this and that and the other. Listen, this is not some administrative exercise. Everybody here, who here is a parent? Who here has ever seen a child spread peanut butter on bread? Then you know all about systematization. Because any little child who wants to spread peanut butter on bread is going to spread it to every single corner. There is not going to be a single piece of that bread that does not have super chunk peanut butter on it. And when they're done, and it's like rocket science, they are completely focused, they've got the knife out, and they are working that bread and being careful not to tear it, but to get the peanut butter everywhere. And as soon as the peanut butter is just right, we're going to work on the jelly. That's systematization, friends. I'm serious. Because all systematization is that you love it so much you want to do it well. That's all it is. Somebody came up to me last night and said something about the story I told about my grandmother and little Johnny Eichenhauer knocking on the door on Saturdays. And she said, thank you for mentioning home visits. And the truth of the matter is, I didn't think of it in those terms. I thought of it in terms of what you do when you love. You go visit the people you care about. And you sit with them and you have apple pie and lemonade. And you talk about the things that are of mutual interest to you because you like spending time with those people. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about spreading peanut butter because we love it. FYI, it is the perfect food. I'm just putting that out there. And we talk about going to visit folks not to see how we can drive the numbers of home visits in a month, but because we care about people and because we want to spend time with them and because we want to receive the richness of their friendship and love. And we want to share a little bit of our friendship and love with them as well. So, just a couple of morning musings. So, where were we? We were talking about things. I want to mention a couple of things, and I want to put them in the context of what we've been talking about with Hope and the family. Because we don't raise our families outside of a social context. We raise our families in society. I was talking about my own childhood and the neighborhood that I was raised in and the things that we did. You know, when we came up, as I said, I lived in the largest geographic ghetto in the continental United States. South Central Los Angeles is huge. LA itself is 100 square miles, so you can imagine how big segments of the city are. And yet we had in our family two realities. One was the Baha'i reality, in which we saw every people of every color and from every nation. And we saw them loving and kind, and we saw them working together to build a community. And it was a kind of richness and a kind of spiritual satisfaction that wouldn't let me remember that we had gone through periods of food insecurity in our family, where mom was drinking tea and we were eating peas because that's what was available. That wouldn't let me remember that my mother, who is fondly known as Dr. Ellis, didn't go to college until she was 55. Because when she was ready to go to college, there was no college for a young black girl to go to. And she went with her older sister, my Aunt Adrian, who, by the way, is now 98 years old. You know what she takes every day? The medication she takes? 1 vitamin. It's like 1 a day. I'm saying, you know, we live in the age of big pharma. Here's my Aunt Adrian, who's 4'9" and never claimed to be 5 feet. And she takes 1 vitamin, and she is as clear. And as a matter of fact, she just finished, just a few years ago, the last book on her latest 3-book deal with Random House. She went to college when she was 64 years old with my mother. Now, the point is to tell you why they went. Our family, because they had become Baha'is, they had decided that we needed to organize our lives. And so my grandfather decided that we're going to have a family council. And it was my grandfather, my grandmother, and the oldest of my mother's siblings. And if you had a problem, that's who you went to talk to. And in this house of my grandfather, they had Webster's Third International Dictionary. And the reason they had Webster's Third was because that was the dictionary that Shoghi Effendi used. So whenever they would receive a letter from the Holy Land, they would stay up all night with the dictionary looking up all the words to make sure that they understood exactly what Shoghi Effendi meant and what they needed to do. And at one point, my grandfather called a meeting of the entire family. And they said, none of us are educated. But the Baha'i writings say that we should gain education. And he read all of the passages in the writings about educating the family and the benefits of education and the fact that the Lord wants us to be knowledgeable and competent. And so he said, our family is going to have a 10-year plan. And in that 10 years, everybody's going to get formal education of some kind. Now, it happened that I was just sneaking up on college age when that happened. But that's when I went to school, my mother went to school, my aunt went to school, and everybody in the family went to school to get a degree of some kind. And exactly 10 years later, Unfortunately, my grandmother and my grandfather had passed by that time. But at that point, my Aunt Adrian was Dr. Reeves, and my mother was Dr. Ellis, and I was Dr. something, and everybody was something. And it was all because of my grandfather's obedience to the writings of Baha'u'llah and him organizing a system out of his love for Baha'u'llah and his love for his family, saying we must be educated. Now, my children grew up and they thought, well, it's just natural to go to college, and it's natural to go to graduate school and to get a professional degree and so on, because by that time it had become a cultural constant in the family. But when I grew up, everybody was bright, but nobody was educated. It didn't mean you didn't know things, and it didn't mean you didn't read books, and it didn't mean you didn't have carefully organized thoughts. But it meant you didn't have a union card. It did. And it meant that work was going to be harder to find. And it meant that sometimes food was scarce. And it meant that most of your clothes came from kids who were growing faster than you were. These are the things that families do because of their love of the Lord and their love of each other. So that was a little bit of the context in which I grew up. And I want to talk about the context in which our families are functioning in the United States. And specifically, I want to reference the recent events in Charlottesville and the things that are going on in the United States, because we're at a turning point in our nation. And it is the social context in which our families will grow and develop. And so I want to try and shed some light on those events from the point of view of the expectations set for us by the Holy Scriptures over time. And so I want to talk about God's view of his creation. I want to talk about the spiritual destiny of America. I want to talk about what that means for us, for Baha'is, and for everyone else in this country. And I want to talk about what we can do with that knowledge and how we can help transform this country into what it was intended to be. So I want to go way back. And I just want to remind us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Baha'u'llah explains to us that God so loved his creation. He loved the idea of his creation so much that he could not conceal it from himself. He said, veiled in my immemorial being, and in the ancient eternity of mine essence, I knew my love for thee. Therefore I created thee, engraved on thee mine image, and revealed to thee my beauty. He said later that this was so true that we should change our view of ourselves. He said, I created thee rich, noble I made thee. Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting. And he said that in the fullness of time, the Bible tells us that in the fullness of time, a world redeemer would come. And the redeemer would be the Lord of hosts. He would be the Almighty Father. He would be the mighty God. And he would redeem the prophecies and promises made by Scripture over time. And that we would see the time of the Cain, of the Lord of hosts. He says that in that time, God would transform us. He says that he will give us one heart. The Bible says, I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, that you may walk in my statutes, and they shall be my people, and I shall be their Lord. The Bible tells us that every race and nation would receive the blessings of God in this day. It says, I will pour out my flesh on all souls. And it sets the expectation that civilization itself will be transformed, that our habits of thought, our habits of the heart, and our habits of behavior will have changed, and it will exert a transformational influence on our habits of political conduct, our habits of economic engagement, our habits of social organization. And the Bible tells us that in this day, the government will be on his shoulders. Whose shoulders? The Lord of hosts, the world Redeemer. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. The Bible tells us that we will be so transformed that our habits of thought will be fundamentally different. It says, his name will be stamped on our foreheads, and his law will be written on the inner tablets of our hearts. And it sets the expectation that we can behold that the tabernacle of God is with men, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying. Neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And it sets the expectation that there will be no need for light, for candles in that day. There will be no night there. There will be no need for candle, neither light of the sun. For the Lord God giveth them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. This is the expectation set by God at the moment of creation. It is the expectation given in the Old Testament so that we would know that no matter the changes and chances of a difficult and contentious world, we would never be abandoned, we would never be left behind, that we would always be in the embrace of God, that he would always be near us. And in those periods of difficulty, we remember, love me that I may love thee, for if thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. Van taught us that. He did. You know, just an aside, Van, that's why we sing. Because in our lives that move so quickly, sometimes we can fall into robotic behavior. And we pray so fast, even God can't understand what we were saying. But when we sing, we pause and reflect. And we say, love me that I may love thee. For if thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. And then we give a chance for the power of those spiritual words to penetrate our hearts and to reorient our minds and to breathe a fresh breath into our hearts and for us to be revived by the spiritual power of the Holy Word of God. Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, and the divine exemplar of all of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, set an expectation which is referred to by Shoghi Effendi in his book, God Passes By. And he's talking about this time when God would give us one heart, and he would stamp his name on our foreheads, and he would write his law on the inner tablets of our hearts. And he explains what the oneness of humankind means. He says that at this time, all of the nations will be merged into one nation. All of the races will be merged into one race. All of the bloods into one blood, all of the hearts into one heart. And what he's talking about is the growth of cooperation and harmony and bonds and ties that are stronger than blood. It may not be literally true that we will all be exactly the same, but what will be spiritually true is that we will have come together with understandings about the way of life, about the principles of life, about the laws of life, that will make us servants of one another and servants of the well-being and the happiness of all people. Now, Shoghi Effendi tells us that the process that humankind will go through to achieve this glorious destiny will be thorny and torturous, replete with setbacks and reverses. But he explains that it will be our willingness to traverse this difficult path with hearts filled with faith and confidence that the Lord is with us and that we can brave any danger and defeat any opposition to our unity, any opposition to our agreement, any opposition to our peace and well-being. It will be that confidence reflected in a life of faith and an organized system of life that brings us together instead of tearing us apart, that will give us the strength to traverse that thorny and tortuous path replete with setbacks and reverses. Shoghi Effendi tells us that all life has advanced with the interplay of crisis and victory. We'll talk a good bit about that tomorrow. But the gist of what he is saying is that these tests are a means of the purification and strengthening of our hearts. They're a means for the fulfillment of age-old prophecies. They are a means for a providential outpouring of celestial grace. They are a means for the revitalization and strengthening of the unity of the friends of God. And so that we should not see these tests and difficulties with fear or trepidation. We should see them as opportunities for us to achieve a new level of understanding, a new level of grace, a new level of faith, a new level of strength. And to know that we are being called upon to contribute to a process that will change the conditions of life for all humankind. So let's talk about this in terms of our country. Now, the main point that I was making is that when we talk about the unity of the races, when we talk about social justice, when we talk about the oneness of humankind, we've got to understand that this is not just a renewal of the spirit of brotherhood. This isn't just a refocus, a reorientation on the need to have justice now. It is not the fact that this group or that group has been disenfranchised. No, friends, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the Bible and every other scripture in human history tells us that this was the purpose of the creation of life by God, period. I am saying that from the very first day, the Lord set the expectation of thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that I will give them one heart, that I will give them a new way of understanding their relationship to me, their relationship to each other, and their relationship to themselves. That the path getting there will be thorny and tortuous, but we will get there. And in the process, we will civilize our nations, and we will civilize our families, and we will civilize ourselves. So let's talk about the United States. And let's talk about where it started in this process. There is a very interesting story in one of Rob Stockman's books, and it's about the first group of American Baha'is that went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the late 1890s. And they went to see Abdu'l-Baha and to present themselves as Baha'is and to hear the words of the Master and to understand better the purpose of the Baha'i faith. And among them was a woman named Helen Hillier Brown. And she asked the question, and she recorded in her diary of the pilgrimage. She asked Abdu'l-Baha, why was America discovered when it was? And according to her pilgrim's notes, Abdu'l-Baha said, something to the effect that it was providential, that God wanted to create the greatest and most powerful nation the world had ever known so that that nation could be the home of the spreaders of the truth. Now, ordinarily, we would simply relegate that to Pilgrim's Notes. And you know, it might be some individual's interpretation of things, but not necessarily scripture for Baha'is. Except that Shoghi Effendi himself extended those same themes. He said that the nation had no significance in and of itself except that it was the shell that enshrined the precious gem of the followers of Baha'u'llah. And that the nation would grow and evolve in its power and its embrace as Baha'is left American shores to spread the truth to the four corners of the earth. So when we look back at the founding of our nation, it is no surprise that we would find expressions of the oneness of humankind as the organizing principle for the establishment of the nation itself. Listen to what people said. In our writings, we say that the continent of America is, in the eyes of the one true God, the land wherein the splendors of his light shall be revealed, where the mysteries of his faith shall be unveiled, where the righteous shall abide and the free assemble. Now listen to what the founders said at the time of the establishment of this country. They said that the past is the textbook of tyranny, and the future is the Bible of the free. George Washington himself said that the bosom of America is open to people of all races, all nations, and all religions. Let them come here, he said, so that we can establish one people and one race and one nation. They said that if you spill one drop of American blood, you have spilled the blood of all the world's peoples. And that's why they said that the motto of this country should be E pluribus unum, out of many people, one people. But we know that the same founders struggled when it came to defining the Articles of the Constitution. And in this land of the free and the home of the brave, people of color were ascribed a fraction of the human value of others. And that is the thorny and tortuous road we walk. And we see this coming to fruition in our electoral politics. We see this on the streets of Charlottesville. We see this when a young white nationalist invades a black church and begins to randomly kill people who are in prayer. But we also see something else. We see those counterforces. What was interesting to me and what moved my heart was when that young man went into that church in South Carolina, and he shot and killed 9 people, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, all gathered together on a Wednesday night for Bible study and prayer and song. And then not 2 weeks later, the survivors of that congregation made a public announcement of forgiveness and prayer for the soul of that young man. In the midst of their grief, in the midst of an inexplicable and horrible loss, their thoughts were transcendent and allegiant only to God, not to the standards of man, but to the standards of God. And the standard of God that they understood was forgiveness. Now, some people would say that that moment was a moment for righteous anger. Those people said, we are above that. This is a moment for transcendence. This is a moment to demonstrate our faith and trust in a loving God. And this is a moment where we will suffer the burdens and losses and the tragedies of the moment and return instead love, faith, and confidence. We saw in the streets of Charlottesville not 2 weeks ago one group who was saying Jews will not replace us, and who were saying that blacks have no place and that we should honor the legacy of the Confederacy. And we saw others who were rising and saying, no, that's not our heritage and that is not our destiny. And what is very interesting is to understand that one group is loud but small, and the other group is growing every day. Consider this. We think that the world is growing more violent every day. Every day we read about terrorism or a bomb in Barcelona or the streets of Charlottesville or somebody killing somebody in a school or in a grocery store. We see one black person after another, women, children, men, gunned down, all unarmed, all going about their business, but now dead. And we think to ourselves, my God, the streets aren't safe. People aren't safe no matter what they do. Here's an interesting way to think about this. Every study that has been done on the subject, and I would point you to a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. It's 942 pages. Written by Steven Pinker, a social psychologist at Harvard. And his premise is that this is the most peaceful and least violent time in the whole of human history. And he says that I had to make this book 942 pages because you won't believe that. And I have to prove it to you. And so he goes through every segment of human history. And he talks about times when 15 to 20% of the entire population of the world was dying a violent death. And he explains those civilizing forces that have systematically reorganized the life of society over a long period of time. The development of the family, the development of the tribe, the development of the city-state, the development of the kingdom, the development of nations, the development of international cooperation, the development of its systems of education, the documents like the International Declaration of Human Rights, the growth of the role of women and their contribution to society, the integrity of the family on a global basis, the development of modern medicine and international cooperation, the spread of knowledge and technology, and all these things giving rise to new ways of thought and new patterns of relationship. He talks about the development of a moral consciousness that has systematically seeped into the understandings of people all around the world, and to such an extent that he helps us understand that the way that we measure the degree of violence in society is by the number of violent deaths per 100,000 people in the population. So a good way to think about this, an easy point of reference, is World War II, because it was the last global conflagration in which the entire world was at war with itself. And during World War II, 665 people were dying a violent death per 100,000. You with me? You know what it is today? 0.03. 0.03. From 665 to 0.03. Which is to say, violence has not been extinguished, but it has been drastically reduced. So why then do we feel more scared and less willing to go into certain parts of the city or to do certain things? Because every time something happens to any individual, it's on the front page of the paper. It's on the 6 o'clock news. It's on All Things Considered. And you know the names and the people and the stories of every single person who has been victimized by violence. And friends, that's not inappropriate. We should know their names, and we should mourn what happened to them, and we should work for change in our communities so that everyone will be safe. But we should not give in to the idea that somehow the world is more violent and we're moving backwards, because the truth of the matter is violence by terrorism is down. Violence by world war is so far down that he projects that war actually ended in the 1980s, and that we are in a period which sociologists call the long peace because of this tremendous length of time between World War II and now. And yes, we've had regional conflicts and regional wars, but not a global conflagration as we did in World War I and World War II. He helps us understand that violence against women, violence against children, violence of every kind, while not gone, has diminished so dramatically that it is a small fraction of what it has been over the course of history. And the reason that I'm telling you this is not to suggest that you should suddenly be happy with our plight, because we got lots of work yet to do. I'm telling you this because it's important that we understand that we are moving in the right direction, and that your contributions and your help and your prayers and your social action will just strengthen the positive and forward movement of your communities and of humankind. And to know that we are winning that battle and that these transformational changes are occurring. There is a woman named Marcia Palley. She is a researcher at Columbia, I think. And she talks about some of the forces that are transforming life. And she talks about global integration, which is leading to demographic diversity on a global scale, but it's also leading to ethnic and racial conflict. She talks about economic globalization, which on one hand is creating wider opportunity for everyone, but it's also dislocating jobs and creating tremendous inequality between rich and poor. She talks about the internet and the proliferation of knowledge. And she says that on one hand, it gives us much more choice, but a lot of that choice is focused on what to buy and when to buy it. And she talks about the growth of knowledge being at one point empowering and at another point destabilizing. And she talks about the culture of autonomy that valorizes individual choice and self-determination and elevates the importance of me, mine, and more. And she says that these forces, global integration, economic globalization, the spread of internet and technology, and the culture of autonomy, me, mine, and more, are challenging us with turbulence and instability. And that what is important is for us in small groups of families and groups of families and communities to organize a system of life which is stabilizing, to choose carefully our values, and to build bonds and ties that are stronger than blood in the understandings that we craft that knit us together. She says that what people want is they want individual freedom and initiative. This is exactly what the House of Justice talked about in the peace statement in the 1980s. They want individual freedom of initiative with creativity and free play for the individual, but based on a system of life that is founded in cooperation, mutual support, and reciprocity. And she says that the way to understand this is to understand the difference between covenants and contracts. It's very interesting. She says because a contract protects interests. We negotiate a deal and we have a contract, and I agree that I'm going to pay you this and you agree that you're going to give me that. She said, but a covenant protects relationships. And she says that a covenant is what you feel when you feel a part of something. When you are a part of a family, you are allegiant to that family and you will do anything for them. I'll never forget the moment when our first child, Camille, was born. And, I had practiced Lamaze, and I'd gone through the lessons, and we were in the birthing room in the hospital, and I was coaching Paula, and Paula was telling me to be quiet. And I suddenly understood the difference between coaches and players. You understand what I'm talking about? I'm coaching, she's playing. We're having a different experience. And suddenly the baby is there, and I am overwhelmed. And I had two spontaneous realizations. The first was, I understand the biology of this, but this is a miracle. And I knew it. And I knew that I had just witnessed a miracle. And the other thing that I realized is that I suddenly realized why people kill. Because I understood that I would do anything to protect that child. That's a covenant. Anything she needed to secure her well-being, to protect her, to keep her safe, and to make sure she feels the love of her mother and father, I would do. That's also systematization, friends. When I fell in love with my wife, I started planning graduate school because I knew that if I was going to win her hand in marriage, I needed a job, and it was going to have to be a good one. And so I needed to get educated, and I needed to prepare myself to provide for my family. Systematization is not about the sophisticated organization or some administrative process. It is what we do to take care of whom we love because we love. And the point that Marcia Pally is making is that when we establish covenants with one another, we open our hearts to bonds and ties that will bring us together forever. And in those situations, there isn't enough we can do for one another. Nothing is enough. We want to take extra steps. I remember so many of my relatives who had very difficult and often painful lives. And all I can think of was how they saw me and how they changed my view of myself. Because when they saw me, there was so much love in their hearts, and there was so much affection and such a high expectation of well-being that I wanted to be the person in their eyes. And it kept me from making all kinds of bad choices. Not because anybody would know, but because I did not want to betray the love they had invested in me. I always wanted to be able to say that I was faithful to the way they saw me and to the hope they had invested in my life. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning all this is to say that we have a special kind of work to do. Creation has a purpose. The Bible tells us that, and every single religion that has followed has amplified that sense of purpose and destiny. We live in a nation which is the standard bearer for a new kind of freedom, which is why our history always refers to our country as the American experiment. Abraham Lincoln said it at Gettysburg. He said, "We started this war for one reason, economics and politics. But what we discovered was that that wasn't why we were fighting at all." He said that the reason we are fighting is to determine whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all human beings are created equal, can long endure. That was the reason we were fighting. So the question then becomes, what do you and I do about this? And what are our obligations as Baha'is? Because you see, it would be one thing if we were sitting in the neighborhood and we didn't have any knowledge of any of these things. But friends, we come together every 19 days. We come together at places like Green Lake. We come together in our study circles and our devotional meetings and so forth. And this is what we pray about. And this is the scripture we read. And these are the things we discuss. And so on our shoulders lays a heavier burden of responsibility and obligation than anybody else's, because we know the truth. And we have a special opportunity and obligation to share it with others. So let's just talk a little bit about how we might see this as Baha'is. In 1919, not far from here, there was the first race war in the continental United States. They called it the Red Summers. And black men and white men were fighting in the streets of Chicago, Cincinnati, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, and other places, but principally those places. There were hordes of men roaming the streets looking for each other for the purpose of open fighting on the streets. The response of the Baha'i Friends was to inaugurate a national campaign of what they called race amity, race love, love for one's fellow human being, no matter culture, color, or ethnic origin. And they created a magazine called Reality Magazine. Excuse me. Reality Magazine, which was dedicated, thank you very much, which was dedicated to the oneness of humankind. Shortly thereafter, the members of the National Spiritual Assembly wrote Shoghi Effendi. This was in the mid-1920s. And they said that they wanted to inaugurate a series of activities to unite the races and to build interracial fellowship and friendship so that the American nation could achieve its spiritual and social destiny. And this is what Shoghi Effendi told them. He said that as this problem, and he was talking about racial conflict and prejudice, and he was speaking in 1927. He said that as this problem in the inevitable course of events grows in acuteness and complexity. Now, he's not just talking about then. He is forecasting the challenges that we will face in the future. He says, and that the number of the faithful, of Baha'is, of both races multiplies. It will become increasingly evident that the future growth and development of the cause of God will be directly related by the manner in which the Baha'is carry out first among themselves and then in their relations with their fellow men those high standards of interracial amity, so widely proclaimed and so fearlessly exemplified to the American people by Abdu'l-Baha. And then Shoghi Effendi says, he asks the rhetorical question, he says, how can hearts that throb with the love of God fail to respond to all the implications of this supreme injunction of Baha'u'llah, which he describes as the hallmark of a true Baha'i character? So let's just review. We go back to what Shoghi Effendi quoted Abdu'l-Baha as saying about God giving us one heart. And he says, by this, by the oneness of humankind, we mean that all the nations will become one race, all the nations will become one nation, all the races one race, all the bloods one blood. So he is talking about the integration of understanding, of cooperation, of international fellowship. And we have seen a world in which the different nations are now organized. And now instead of 54 countries on the African continent, you have the African Union. And instead of a wide variety of countries with different standards and different political orientations in Europe, you have the European Union. And you have the Pan-Asian Organization of National Cooperation. And gradually, this is giving rise to the understanding of economic interdependence and political interdependence and social interdependence. And when you add the activating elements of global integration and economic globalization and so on, you see that we are being driven toward this blending process where all of the nations cannot escape the conditions that exist in any individual nation. What did Martin Luther King said? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are all tied together in a single garment of destiny. What happens to one directly happens to all of us indirectly. And that is exactly the portrait that was being painted by Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha. And now Shoghi Effendi is telling us that this problem will grow in acuteness and complexity. Why? Because it is the plan of God to give us one heart, to galvanize all humanity so that we are brothers and sisters independent of nation or race or ethnic origin. And our process for achieving that glorious destiny, what did he say? Is thorny and tortuous, replete with setbacks and reverses. So he goes on to describe what we should do. And I want to mention this for a couple of reasons. First of all, Shoghi Effendi is talking about 1927. But what he describes is exactly the same as the current plan of the Universal House of Justice in 1927. And he says that one of the things that we should do is we should not content ourselves to gather in conference halls or at banquet tables, but that we should change our very approach to life itself. He says that in their homes, in their hours of relaxation and leisure, in the daily conduct of their business transactions, in the association of their children, whether in study classes, on playgrounds, in club rooms, or in short, in all possible circumstances, however insignificant they appear. The community of the followers of Baha'u'llah should satisfy themselves that in the eyes of the world at large and in the sight of their vigilant master, they are living witnesses to those truths which he fondly cherished and tirelessly championed to the very end of his life. So he's saying that in every aspect of our life, we should build a system of life, an approach that is driven by a relentless love for all people. Now, when you think about the current plan, let's just talk about what it is and what it is not. We tend to be blinded by the many things the current plan has for us to do, but that's not the purpose of the plan at all. The purpose of the plan is to build a system of life that is divine in origin and inspiration, and to give us disciplines of thought, disciplines of heart, and disciplines of behavior, which will overcome conflict and injustice and replace it with harmony and love. And the assumption of the plan is that unless we cultivate these disciplines in the way we think, the way we open our hearts, and the things we do every day, we will not be able to build "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So Shoghi Effendi goes on and he tells us that if we relax in this obligation, not only will we slow the inevitable march of humanity toward its glorious destiny, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," but he said that we would retard the flow of those divine energies that come from heaven to help us all. So this is our mandate. So I wanted to tell you a couple of stories just to bring this to life and just remind you, call to mind some names that many of us knew. You all remember Dave Rue. Dave Rue was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in the 50s. And you remember Dave had a rock jaw, and didn't he look like a Pentagon general? Kind of a hawk nose and a rock jaw, a big, tall guy. He looked like he should be commanding something. And Dave was a medical doctor, and he was the person who invented the technique of teaching surgical practices by filming them. Dave did that. Well, in 1948, Dave and Margaret Rue were a young couple in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dave was a white Baha'i in the Deep South, having freshly graduated from medical school and having taken his first assignment as a medical doctor. And of course, he was having firesides in his house in 1948 in Atlanta, Georgia. And his firesides were full of black people and white people. So one day, at Dave's fireside, he hears a commotion in his front yard, and he goes out and stands on the porch, and what's in front of his house is the Ku Klux Klan. And not just the Klan with torches and guns, because they had both. They had torches and guns, and they were robed. But they were being led by the sitting governor of the state of Georgia at the time, Herman Talmadge. That's right. And they said, "You get those black people out of your house, or we'll burn it down." And Dave, standing on his porch by himself, armed only with courage and love, looked at them, called their names, and told them that they were not welcome at his home or in his yard, and they would kindly be dismissed. And they left. Because there's something about the power of the truth. Now, they could have burned him down, they could have shot him, they could have overwhelmed him, they could have beat him up, they could have taken all those people out and hung them, as they have done before and have done since. But all by himself, he stood up there and he said, "These are my guests, these are my friends, they are safe in my home, they enjoy my protection, you are not welcome here, and you will be gone." And that is the kind of moral courage that changes things. I want to tell you, you remember Firuz Kazemzadeh, who just passed away. Firuz, it was 1963 when two white men who were visiting a black family for purposes of civil rights in Mississippi were dragged out of that home, shot, and hung. So Firuz wrote a letter to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in 1963, and he said, "Let me go." Firuz was a full professor at Yale. And he said, "This won't change until they arrest someone who, in the eyes of society, has standing and place." He said, "Let me go. I'll stay at the home of one of the black friends. I have a black friend," and he named him. He said, "I'll stay at his home, and they will arrest me, and I'll face the music. And then we'll work it through the courts with the Yale Defense Fund. And we'll demonstrate the truth that the Constitution and the law of this land is interracial fellowship." That was the kind of courage and bravery we're talking about. Let me tell you about the Bahia Vista School in Central California. Here is a school where all of the children are the daughters and sons of migrant laborers. And so their parents pick lettuce and tomatoes and almonds for a living. And at the Bahia Vista School, the kids speak 27 different languages. And very few of them speak English. And so the school applied for a grant for a foundation which I served on the Board of Visitors. And I happened to be able to visit the school to assess what they were doing with the grant. And what they applied for was the idea that we would have turned the entire school into English as a second language. And here's what happened in the course of 6 years. When the kids came into school, they spoke 27 different languages. The second language that a child acquired was often not English, it was the language of their best friend. So a Vietnamese child, his second language might be Spanish, and his third language would be French. But by actual measurement, by the time these kids reached the 6th grade, they were fluent in at least 3 languages, and they were at the top of the state in reading, writing, and arithmetic by examination. Because the integration of their ways of thinking and their approaches to life and the development of the different languages and the power of that diversity was so strong that it elevated the intellectual and moral development of all of the kids. Now, it is interesting. Scott Page at the University of Michigan has demonstrated that diversity is not just a question of something you ought to want to do because it's morally right. He said that by actual measure, diversity makes us smarter because it combines different perspectives on the same problem and inspires deeper insight. And interestingly, he said that the bigger the problem, the better the diverse group does in thinking about it and devising approaches. He said that this is so true that a group of generalists with relevant knowledge consistently outperform experts in their area of expertise simply because they look at things differently than the experts do. And that's what we see with the Bahia Vista kids. That suddenly these kids who were destined not to speak the language of the country, not necessarily to graduate from high school, not to prosper as individuals, are lifted up by all of their diversity. And they come out better educated than kids at private prep schools, learning 3 and 4 languages, being able to converse and deal with anyone, because that is their social orientation, and that's the destiny of our nation. So what I'm trying to say is that this approach that our faith has given us to understand that we are champions of social justice who will do everything we can to change our lives, our families, our kids, our own orientation, in our business affairs, on the playgrounds, in our study groups, and so forth, to integrate the idea that we must all come together and work together and establish these bonds and ties that are stronger than blood. Not only does it have the effect of reorienting the way we think and reorienting the openness of our heart and changing our patterns of conduct, it has an economic effect, it has a political effect, and it exerts its influence on the nation as a whole. So just a couple of other things. Just a couple of other examples to give you to demonstrate how this works. Let's go back to Dave and Meg Rue, because a few years after they were in Atlanta, he was offered a fellowship in Houston. And because it was a prestigious university, the fellowship came with membership in a very elite social club. But of course, an elite social club in 1953 was whites only. So the first day that Margaret and Peg and Dave Rue came to the swim and tennis club, they brought a Nigerian colleague. And as they approached the water, Dave encouraging his friend on a hot day in Houston to cool himself in the waters, everybody else got out. It was mass evacuation from the swimming pool. And Dave looked around and looked at his colleague and looked at Margaret and said, "Oh, we got the pool all to ourselves. Let's swim some laps." Now, see, ordinarily, people would be thinking about their social status and their, what are people going to say and what are the repercussions? That was not their point. Let me tell you about the Green Street Gang. Every year in Chicago, the Commissioner of Human Relations would release data on the growth of hate crimes. And one year I said to him, Clarence, I understand that hate crime is expanding in this neighborhood or that neighborhood, but is that really what we need to know? I said, what about people who are getting along? Shouldn't we take a look at them? And shouldn't we learn something from them about how they are stabilizing their neighborhoods and building unity and understanding in their neighborhoods? And his response was, well, we can't do that. And I said, well, why? He said, well, because people will laugh at us. I said, well, why is that? He said, well, because if it bleeds, it leads. If it's violence, it's serious. But if you're just getting along, who cares about that? And so I said, well, let's do it anyway. And let's just figure this out. And so we did it in Chicago and in 60 communities across the country. And here's what we found. We found that interracial and intergroup cooperation was as widespread and deeply entrenched, in fact, more so than division was. But the problem was that nobody paid attention to it. So we found things like a group I called, a neighborhood that I called the Green Street Gang. Here was a neighborhood that had been overcome by crime and gangs. And inevitably, one day, a child was killed. And this working class neighborhood of black people, brown people, and white people got together and said, we've got to do something. And the mayor's gang intervention program is not the answer for us because it's not going to do anything but call meetings and hold press conferences. So here's what they did. They reorganized their job schedules so that parents could be physically present in the neighborhood whenever kids were out of school. They took the park at the end of the corner, and which was gang headquarters, and they repainted the lines of the basketball court, and they fixed the jungle gym, and they fixed the carousel, and they fixed the swings, and they planted flowers. And they put flowers on the stoops of every one of their brownstones. And they would sit out there and be with the children. And in the period of 8 months, gang violence went from a weekly occurrence to the departure of the gang from the neighborhood. And it was the power of unity that did that. And as the parents began to realize we can safeguard our children through cooperation and understanding and working together, other developments began to occur. They said, we've got issues with how our kids are treated at school. Let's go talk to the school principal and the teachers to talk about how they're engaging our children. And we've got issues with the medical treatment and our access to care at the local hospital. Let's go talk to the healthcare system about how they can engage our community in a different way. And they began to transform the community, building these bonds, these understandings, these bridges of cooperation that not only made people safe, it stabilized the neighborhood, it freed it from violence, and it began to manifest itself in a new way of life. There was a single white man. He was short, fat, and bald. And he was one of the richest men in Chicago. Lived right down the street from Michael Jordan. And every day, he decided that he was going to build gardens in Cabrini Green. Do you know what Cabrini Green is? It was one of the largest projects in Chicago. And it was a place people didn't even want to drive through. And he would go there every day at 5 o'clock with basketball knee pads and gardening tools. And he would systematically pick debris out of the dirt and turn the dirt over. And nobody bothered him because they thought he was crazy, and insanity can be contagious. But everybody knew that that crazy white man is going to come and clean the dirt more at 5 o'clock. Let's go watch him. And so they came, he would come, and he would turn over the dirt and clean it. And finally, one of the kids asked him, well, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm planting a garden. And so gradually, a larger and larger group of kids began to help him put together gardens until they had a system of gardens throughout the housing projects. And they were raising a radicchio and arugula and basil, and selling it to the very best restaurants in Chicago. And they used that to establish a college fund for each one of the kids who helped build the garden. And over a period of 14 years, they had regional distribution with a trucking line, and they had the very best restaurants using what they called Cabrini greens. And they were incorporated by a young black attorney who had been a child working in those gardens with that man and who had gone to college from the funds he earned as a helper gardener. And he became a lawyer, and he incorporated Cabrini Greens as an LLC. And over time, more than 500 kids went to college as a direct result of one man's activity. Now, you know what that means. That means that they're going to have jobs. It means that they're going to be able to have a stable life. It means that their kids are going to be educated, and a whole system of life changes. So, friends, I've given you a lot of information this morning, and I am sorry to burden you with so much detail, but I really wanted to make 3 points. The first is that at the moment of creation, God intended for us to be one and for us to be united. And he warned us that our path to that unity would be thorny and tortuous, replete with setbacks and reverses. It will be difficult. But he said that in the end, he would send us a succession of messengers that would help us along our way. And then he would send the world Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, the Prince of Peace, the mighty God, the Father, and we know his name as Baha'u'llah. And his mission would be to unite all the religions into one religion by helping them understand that they were extensions of the same truth. To unite all the races into one race by helping them understand that they were the children of the same loving Father. And by helping to unite all of the nations into one unified world based on these understandings of unity and cooperation. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is our role in this process? You know, when Michael Brown was shot by a policeman in Ferguson, it was the Baha'i community that was helping to organize the larger community into a progressively more peaceful and effective response. It was the Baha'i community that was pulling together the police force and the fire department and members of the community to begin to talk about how those relationships should change. What we saw on the news were the streets of Ferguson burning. What we did not see was the work the Baha'i community was doing to build unity and trust so that there could be a more stable future. And what I am suggesting to us is that all of us in our own ways can contribute in some way. That when we open our homes to different people and we begin to develop a true relationship, a true friendship, that is a contribution to the same process. When we realize that our objective is not to see color, it is not to see color. Our objective is to understand the beauty of the differences of color and the richness diversity adds to our lives, that we are not all the same. We don't have these same understandings, the same experiences, but that we contribute these to each other to build a richer life for everyone. So I'm about out of time here, so let me just mention one other thing. There is a passage in the collection of letters that we call the World Order of Baha'u'llah. And in this passage, Shoghi Effendi is describing a period of profound turbulence and chaos in American society. And he's talking about conflict in the streets, he's talking about social disquiet, he's talking about the rumors of a larger world war,
and he is describing a situation in which the underpinnings that hold society itself together are beginning to unravel. And he turns his attention to the individual Baha'is. And he acknowledges that we're small in number, that we have no particular social notoriety or influence, but that we can have a transformational effect on life itself. I'll tell you how transformational. I sat in the White House when the President of the United States said that they had been all over the world, and everywhere they went, the linchpins of the most progressive social change and social development they saw were always the Baha'i community. And he said that he had come to believe, this was Clinton, by the way, that he had come to believe that the secret power of the Baha'is was their absolutely undeviating commitment to unity and what you all call the spiritual process of consultation. And he said that he wanted to be able to establish certain laws for the nation. One was debt forgiveness for any nation that established a democracy who promised to spend the money they owed the United States on education, agriculture, and healthcare. But he said that the only way they thought they could do it is if they understood better how to apply the Baha'i principles of spiritual consultation to the legislative process. By the way, that law passed and has benefited scores of nations. And so he made me promise that I would send all of the Baha'i teachings on consultation. Now, what's interesting about this is that we think we're invisible. We think nobody knows about us. We think we're just going on in our little communities doing what we can. And here I am sitting in the White House in a small meeting of people, and sitting at the table with the leader of the free world. And he's talking to me about what he learned from the Baha'is and how he can apply that to the betterment of the nation and the world. So let's not think that our efforts, however humble we think they are unseen and have no effect. Here's what Shoghi Effendi says. He says, would it seem extravagant in the light of so sublime an utterance to expect that in the midst of so enviable a region of the earth, right here in the United States, and out of the agony and wreckage of an unprecedented crisis, there should burst forth a spiritual renaissance, which, as it propagates itself through the instrumentality of the American believers, will rehabilitate the fortunes of a decadent age. Friends, that's our mission. That's what we're here to do. That's how we can help establish one heart among the peoples of the earth. Thank you. Well, good morning. My goodness. So when Emily called me and asked me if I would come to Green Lake, which we always want to do because it's just so beautiful to be in this idyllic environment and just drowning in the love of the friends, I had one condition. I said, Emily, I'll come if you sing. And she had a lame excuse. She said, well, I'm not on the program, and there's no time for me to do this. I said, well, I'm not on the program either, so there's certainly no time for me. And she hemmed and hawed, and I said, listen, Emily, if I had a voice like yours, I'd come and sing. But then I was watching her do some warm-ups in the back,
when she gets ready to have this incredible impact on our souls with her magnificent voice. And I realized why she's singing, because I can't. Not even a little bit. Now, last night, Eric Dozier told us that if we can't sing, we should hum. Well, I've just found my station in life. I'm going to be a hummer for the rest of my life. But friends, truly, when we hear this magnificent and deeply soulful tribute to Baha'u'llah, we feel him in our hearts. And we know that the power to establish the kingdom of heaven on earth is with him, through his word and through his person. God promised him that he would achieve this victory, which would be the fulfillment of all of the prophecies of all of the prophets gone by. And Emily, we are just so deeply grateful that God has blessed you with this talent that inspires us at the bottom of our hearts. And from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you. So I woke up this morning and I was trying to figure out, what is it about Greenacre that makes us so tired? I mean, it has that effect on me. And I'm wondering, it can't be age. Although I will confess to a bit more resilience in bygone years. But you know what I actually think it is? I think that what happens is we come up here and we experience just a drop of the kingdom. And we feel the love of the friends, and we feel completely immersed in that love. And we know the origin of that love. We know that Baha'u'llah has touched each one of your hearts, and that the love that radiates in your smiling eyes and your warm hellos is a love that is reflected from your devotion to Baha'u'llah. That we are training ourselves and reorienting ourselves to be less of me and more of him, more allegiant to the spirit of his revelation, more compliant to the principles, more obedient to the laws, more resonant in the spirit. And when we have that kind of environment and a large number of people who reflect that love, we just feel different. And we relax in a way that is uncommon in our day-to-day lives, which are so filled with obligation and duty, running from one task to the next. Our minds too preoccupied with the things we must accomplish to pause and reflect. But when we come to this little island of paradise with the green lake, and all we have time to do is bask in the love of the friends and sing the praises of our Lord and look at the natural splendor that he created, we do find a relaxation. And unfortunately, in my case, that relaxation is my undoing. Because I realize all the air goes out of my balloon. And I just feel better. I feel like I could sleep for 6 months. I am that relaxed, and my heart is happy. So I was thinking about the evening last night, Eric, and I woke up thinking, this land is my land. This land is your land, from California to the other place. And I was just thinking how we have this wonderful
opportunity to fill each moment with happiness, that we have the power to choose what condition we will be in. And I was in the workshop yesterday, the workshop called Why We Sing. And we were talking about, or they were talking about, Genevieve and Eric were talking about songs. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. And all I could think about was Baha'u'llah's hidden word, thou art my lamp and my light is in thee. And I was thinking about a moment that I had experienced in Landig, at the Landig Academy in Switzerland, the Baha'i Academy in Switzerland. And during the week we were there were musicians from all over the world, and they were all jazz musicians. And they had taken the Baha'i writings and paired verses of Baha'u'llah with jazz standards that we have known and loved for so many years. And I remember at one point, it was probably about Thursday, and by this time, we were drowning in the tears of joy and relief and exaltation. And one of the friends got up and read a passage from the 4 valleys and the 7 valleys. And the passage was from the Valley of Love, where Baha'u'llah is talking about the relationship of suffering at a profound level with the birth of the capacity to love, that the loved ones feed on the fragments of their broken hearts, that they have known the deepest grief and sorrow. And then they sang an old and venerated jazz tune, You Don't Know What Love Is Until You Know the Meaning of the Blues. And somehow it just made so much sense that Baha'u'llah has given rise to so many expressions of affirmation, so that every people in every land, of every race and language, would be able to sing his praises and to work out the grief and the challenges in their lives and achieve an exalted station, a higher station of certitude and confidence in faith. Abdu'l-Baha has told us that we have the power to choose our condition. He has instructed us and taught us to understand that all of the prejudice and hate that exists in the world is a result of historical habits of thought and habits of relationship, which are passed down from one generation to the next without question or examination. But he tells us that we have the power to choose our condition. And he says that this is a core element of the power of thought. He says that there is nothing as heartbreaking and as terrible as an outburst of human savagery. And he says that he says, I charge you all that each one concentrate your thoughts, all of the thoughts of your heart, on love and unity. He said, when a thought of war comes, oppose it with a stronger thought of peace. A thought of hatred must be destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. And then he says, thoughts of war bring destruction to all harmony, all harmony. Now, friends, if a thought of war brings destruction to all harmony, then what of a thought of estrangement? What of a thought of hesitation to openness? What of a thought of a momentary discord or conflict? Wouldn't that be an extension of the same continuum that Abdu'l-Baha is teaching us about? Isn't what he's saying to us that there is no place in the reality of this life, no time and no place for thoughts of estrangement, thoughts of disquiet and conflict, thoughts of contention, let alone thoughts of war? And he says, by contrast, our thoughts of love are transformational. And they aren't simply transformational for us. The words of praise we sing when we pray, the words of praise we sing when we sing, the way that we struggle inside our hearts to turn those thoughts of conflict or estrangement into unity and love, to be preoccupied with the construction of a bridge from my heart to yours, and to say, this road is thorny and tortuous. It is replete with setbacks and reverses. We see sorrow everywhere we look, but our job is not to focus on the sorrow. Our job is to construct that bridge to love, construct that bridge to trust and confidence, construct that bridge that will lead us to a higher and deeper understanding of Baha'u'llah's purpose for us in this creation. And to understand that everything we do, every time we try to bring a smile to the hearts of any soul, every time we try to comfort the disquiet of anyone, every time we try to solve a problem that is resting on the shoulders of friend or foe, we are performing a service that is not only transformational to our individual spiritual conditions, and not only transformational to the relationship between you and that other soul, but it is a fundamental building block in the foundation of a new civilization that the Bible has called the kingdom of heaven on earth. So let us be clear that our lives are at once about ourselves and at the same time about everybody else. And that the efforts we make to understand the meaning of the Baha'i writings, the efforts we make to overcome our own base inclinations and tendency toward conflict or estrangement, the efforts we make to build these bridges of understanding and cooperation and love from one heart to another is transformational for us, and at the same time lays the foundation for the kingdom that will be the salvation of every single soul on the planet. We've been talking a little bit about the forecast that God gave us about the purpose of creation and the intent of creation to build the kingdom of heaven on earth, that he would give us one heart and he would write his law on the inner tablets of our hearts, and he would stamp his name on our foreheads, and we would see his face, and we would be his people, and he would be our God. That is the kingdom that we are in service of to construct. And we've been talking about the phenomena of the gift that we have been given to play a small part in this process. Now, there is a tablet Baha'u'llah wrote to Mullah Syed Mehdi. And in this tablet, he said that if it had been the pleasure of God, he could have summoned the lion of knowledge and wisdom, whose roar would be so overwhelming that it would compel all humankind to bow down on its knees and submit to the authority of God. He said, but through the grace of God, I have given my children a role to play in the construction of this kingdom. Now let's be clear. Ours is the minor role. But we've got to spread that peanut butter all over that bread so that everybody gets a good bite. That's why we systematize. Now, at the heart of this is an assumption. And it is an assumption which we should think about in our day-to-day lives. And that is the assumption that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That we may not be blessed with any particular talent or extraordinary ability. We're not like Emily. Eric, I'm a hum for many years, and I'm never going to get there. My heart's in it, but I'm just not going to get there. But we don't have to achieve that level of artistic brilliance, because we belong to a faith in which we are promised that ordinary people can be transformed to do extraordinary things. And as I was thinking about that this morning, I remembered a funny story about our brother Steve Jackson, who, after many years of distinguished service at the Baha'i National Center, building the foundation of what has become a very successful financial organization, went to Africa to work for a bank in Uganda and help build their systems and help their bank achieve a modern level of sophistication and administrative efficiency. And while he was there, he was playing golf with his visiting son, Charles. And it was kind of a makeshift golf course. You know, in Africa, it didn't look like Pebble Beach. But they were standing on the putting green, about to sink a putt, and all of a sudden they heard a rustle in the bushes just outside the green. And you know, I've been to Africa a lot. I'm going to tell you that when you hear a rustle in the bushes, you ought to pay attention to that. Because you don't know exactly what's going to come out of those bushes. It could be a good thing or it could be a not good thing. And out of the bushes come guerrilla fighters armed with bad guns. Guns that don't kill animals, they kill people. And so there's Charles and Steve, and they're on the putting green, and here come these soldiers, and they creep through the bushes. They walk up on the green. They're slow, and they're looking around, and they've got their machine guns in their hands and their rifles in their hands, and they're looking at Charles and Steve, and God knows what Charles and Steve are thinking. They're probably thinking, oh God, guide me, protect me, illumine the lamp of my heart. And God willing, they just kept creeping through the green and back into the bushes on the other side and disappeared. So my question to Steve was, did you sink the putt? You know, I wanted to know how much game he had. But you know, that's what I'm talking about. We're ordinary people. You know, we pay the mortgage and pay the bills and go to work and do all the things that everybody's got to do. But somehow, because of our belief in Baha'u'llah, We have been given an opportunity to do extraordinary things. And we don't think of ourselves as making that big a difference. But friends, I'm here to tell you that the Baha'i friends do. I was sitting, again, in the White House, and I was talking to the Secretary of Agriculture, and he looked at me and he said, you know, I know a lot more about the Baha'i faith than the three onennesses. I said, well, if you know about the three onennesses, you know a lot about the Baha'i faith. And he said, well, I used to be the congressman for Wichita, Kansas. And he said, you know, in Wichita, Kansas, there were probably 50 or 60 Baha'is, but they were in charge of everything. If there was a race unity initiative, the Baha'is had organized it. If there was an equality of women and men initiative, Baha'is had organized it. If there was something for children or youth or junior youth or poverty mitigation, so the Baha'is were always at the core of it. And it was always an open system. Everybody was willing to join. They never stole the money. They never quit. They were always the first ones there and the last to leave. And you would think from all the activity that there were 50,000 Baha'is in the city. Just last week, a friend told me a story of Prince Charles in England. The exact same story, where he was invited to meet the Queen, and Prince Charles came up to him and started talking about the Baha'is. And he said the very same thing, that everywhere he went, the Baha'is were in the forefront of doing the things that were really making a fundamental change in the conditions of life in these places. This is the same thing that I heard in the White House. I was in Senegal, and I was a part of a negotiation with 26 African countries to build a fiber optic cable all the way down the coast of Africa. Now, this is going to bring Africa into the digital world. It's going to connect the digital divide. It is going to illuminate the African continent with modern information technology, which will stimulate economic development. So we've got 26 nations working on this. And the problem is that every nation wants it for itself, but each nation doesn't want the other nation to get it. And so it's really difficult. And we're in West Africa, so the predominant, these are Francophone countries, and in most cases, they are Muslim. So we are negotiating this thing for 8-day periods once a month for about 16 months. Long process. Everybody gets to know each other really well. And we would go to lunch, and the lunches would be very long. And they would talk about Islam, and they would talk about this and that and the other. And every now and again, I just throw a little nugget in there about Islam, because they think that if you're an American, you don't know anything about Islam. But if you're a Baha'i, you know one or two things. So I just throw a nugget out there every now and again, just to ping it and see if anything came back. And I would notice that an eyebrow would be raised somewhere on the table, and we're all kind of sitting together. So big table, got 2 representatives from each one of the 26 nations, and we're eating together every day and talking and lots about Islam, and every now and again I just say a little something. So one day they dispatched a delegate to approach me, and I'm getting some coffee, and he comes in and he says, "Bob, I have been sent to ask you, what is your book? What religion do I belong to?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Baha'i." Now, I don't know how this is going to go. We're in the midst of a very contentious negotiation. There's a lot of everything involved. A lot of complexity, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of politics, a lot of history.
This goes good, a lot of people benefit. This does not go good, a lot of people get hurt. And his face was wreathed in smiles. A Baha'i. And then we go back to the lunch table, and he announces, Bob is a Baha'i. And all of a sudden, I saw the greatest unity that we had experienced during the entire contentious negotiation. And I'll tell you why. Because every single delegate from every single one of the nations started telling stories about how the Baha'is were at the center and the forefront of the most progressive and constructive movements in their respective countries. The Baha'is are doing this, and the Baha'is are doing that, and everybody had a better story than everybody else. And really, it was the only thing anybody agreed on. And so, now, here's the reality. Now, I've visited lots of those countries, and I know the Baha'i communities in those countries. You know, and they're struggling to get the feast organized, and nobody's on time, and... Wait a minute, have you been to that community? And they've got problems with this one and that one, and the kids won't act right, and you know the Baha'i community I'm talking about. But the community that they were talking about was the one whose arms were open to all people of all tribes and all religions, the ones who involved everyone in the consultation about the things that would most benefit our communities, and the ones who were on the forefront of educating children and organizing youth and advancing civil society and starting birthing clinics and little lending libraries and clean water. I had the Minister of Health from South Africa was telling a story about how AIDS had ravaged the townships, and HIV was just devastating people, and she explained that people were dying primarily not of HIV, but of all the secondary infections that came from not having clean water and not having fresh bedding and so forth. And so she is making a big presentation to an audience about this size, and she's describing this group that would come once a week and change the bedding and freshen the water and help people get clean and so forth, and how that had driven down the mortality rate by 40%. Just clean water and fresh bedding and so forth. And she said it's a tiny little group, they don't have any money, and I thought to myself, that sounds just like the Baha'is. So after the talk, I went up to her and I introduced myself, and we had a lovely conversation, and I said, tell me, the group that you talked about that came so regularly and provided such a significant service, who were those people? And before I could even get the question out, she said, oh, those are the Baha'is. You see, so friends, we think of ourselves as invisible. We think of ourselves as virtually powerless. And we are indeed ordinary people. But we have been given the extraordinary knowledge of Baha'u'llah, and we sail on the wings of his powerful revelation, and we are quite literally on a mission from God to benefit and promote the well-being and the happiness of every human being on the earth, and Baha'u'llah has empowered us to accomplish that task. So, I want to suggest to you that that has implications for the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about our marriages, the way we think about our children, and our stewardship as parents, for the way we think about our membership in a Baha'i community, and the way we think about our service to the larger community. And I want to suggest to you
that in every moment we have a choice to make. And that choice is to extend open arms of love and welcome. That choice is to be tolerant. Now, there is a tablet that Abdu'l-Baha wrote to Nasruddin Shah. And you can imagine this. Nasruddin Shah dedicated his life to promote the suffering of Abdu'l-Baha's father. Every decision he made was to hurt and disadvantage Baha'u'llah. And yet Abdu'l-Baha writes him a letter of loving kindness. And true mercy and forgiveness. And in the letter he says that the time has come where we have to change the way we think about our membership in humanity. That we are not isolated as persons or kingdoms, but that we are all leaves on the same branch of the tree of God, the tree of life. And he says that we must reorient our ways of thought and our habits of the heart and our behavior to embrace all humankind high and low. He says that this is so true that we must regard every stranger as an intimate friend. He said that we must offer a helping hand to our fallen oppressor. Put an end to alienation and ban foreignness forever. He says that the time has passed when men can glory in material power or military dominance. I can kill so many. I can dominate so many. I employ so many. He said that time is gone. He said that we should occupy ourselves in tasks and in a spirit of service that brings happiness to the inmates of paradise. Because soon, our time on this dust heap will be over, and we will join our friends in the next realm of life. And so he gives us a charge. Now, he's talking to the king, but he's also talking to you and me. To be a treasury to the poor and a cure for the ailing. An uplifter of every victim of oppression. A father and a mother to every orphan. He says that when you engage in this work, you may find yourself the target of derision and criticism and hostility. But he says, disregard it completely and think ye in the opposite way. He said, be sincerely kind, not in appearance only. And then he explains to us how this mission of service, born of God, given to us by Baha'u'llah, and requiring a transformation in the way we think about ourselves and our relationship to others, in the way we open our hearts to a wider love, a wider embrace to every single person, and the way we organize our lives in patterns of service to others. And he explains to us that if we engage in these things that he has asked us to do, that we will transform this dark world which is filled with misery and pain. And he said, we will banish the darkness forever and ever. Now, friends, he didn't expect Nasruddin Shah to do that work. He expected you and me to do that work. He wrote the letter to Nasruddin Shah as a kindness and a mercy to the king, giving him yet another chance to respond to the call of Baha'u'llah. But this is, as the Bible tells us, the time when the meek inherit the earth. And so the job has fallen to the likes of us, ordinary people who have been empowered by God to do extraordinary things. Now, we've talked a little bit about how thorny and torturous this road of service can be and how difficult life is. And we began remembering the recent events, particularly of racial conflict and the outburst of racial nationalism in Charlotte, the killings in Ferguson, in New Jersey, in Michigan, in Texas, in Ohio, in Cleveland, in California. And we've remembered that there doesn't seem to be a way to respond. Everybody's concerned. Everybody's upset about this. But nobody has a plan. But we have a plan. First of all, we have to remember that the structure of the 5-year plan is not about activities, not about how it was implemented, not about activities. Here's what it's about. It is about building a system of life that is based on divine teachings. And it is about cultivating those disciplines, those habits of thought, those habits of the heart, and those habits of behavior, which will give us sufficient strength and power to be ordinary people who accomplish extraordinary things. That's the essence of the plan. And for all of the detailed confusion or this or that, or somebody said whatever, forget all that. Because what the House of Justice has told us is that this plan is about learning. So we can engage this systematic study of the Word of God. We can reach out to our neighbors who are confused about the direction of our country. And their hearts are filled with concern and anxiety about the hatred that has become a public announcement, about the conflict that we see on our streets, about the people that are fallen dead who were unarmed and pose no risk to anyone. Now, don't you think that some tea and some deep conversation about that, and perhaps even a devotional gathering, would be a welcome balm to their hearts? And the 5-year plan invites us to take up social action. And I'll tell you something about social action. You see, here's another case in which the Baha'is do not understand how big their impact is on the nation as a whole, because we're just laboring in our communities, trying to get the kids to be quiet at feast and to start on time, and wondering if Steve brought the cookies. But here's the reality. I was a federal commissioner on the Martin Luther King Federal Holiday Commission. That commission established Martin Luther King's federal holiday. And every year, we had to make a report to Congress and to the President about race unity activity in the nation. And every year, we did the same thing. They would turn to the Baha'is would survey the Baha'i community. We would find that we had somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 discrete race unity projects going on all over the United States. And it was everything. It was in the schools, it was in the hospitals, it was with law enforcement, it was with everything you can imagine. And that's the report we would submit to Congress and to the president. Not the report of somebody else's activities, the report of your activities. And in the meantime, we're thinking about in terms of ourselves as, we're not doing enough, we're not teaching enough, we're not giving enough to the fund, we're not spiritual enough, we should pray harder, our kids should be quiet at feast, all these things. That's our view of ourselves. But friends, we are ordinary people laboring in unmitigated obscurity, doing extraordinary things, whether it's in Africa or the United States or in Europe or any place else. So what we need to do is think not about the tactical mechanics of this plan or that plan, but think about the fundamental purposes that we have been called to serve. And ask ourselves, just like Eric has been talking about all weekend, everything out of his mouth is, our family prays together. Our family sings together. We're all going to come up on stage and play for you. And we're all going to sing together. And last night, his definition of family became everybody who had come to his workshop who was on the stage in an instant choir that sounded pretty good. And what cracked me up, Eric, was you were talking about how this music gives us joy. And I'm sitting way in the back watching some of the brothers in the back get the Holy Ghost. And they're just all over the place. And what it really is, they're just dancing and moving and thinking, because, having our hearts invaded with happiness and joy is a new experience for many of us. Well, let's get used to it. Let's just manufacture some so that it becomes a regular experience and say, oh yeah, I know all about joy. I got happiness down. I got so much happiness I can give you a little bit. I'll tell you something about growth, and let's just take apart some of the mechanics of that happiness. The truth of the matter is, the only good advice I got when Paul and I got married was don't have kids until you can't live without them. It was very good advice. Now, I didn't understand it at the time, and I didn't pay attention to it. The only thing that kept us from having kids was that I was in graduate school working on my doctoral dissertation, and we didn't have time or money. But here's what I came to understand, and I think that this dynamic was true for our family, and I think it's true for the Baha'i community as well. What I began to realize is that when we got married, our main job was to expand our hearts to accommodate each other. So my heart had to get bigger so that I could put Paula and me in it together. And then our next job was just we're living hand to mouth, producing just enough love to feed the relationship and to help it survive and grow. But gradually, we start to get good at it. And suddenly, we're producing more love than we need to sustain our relationship. And then we got all this love left over. And it's all over the place. We got a lot of it, we're happy, life is good, and we got all this love left over, and it's not going anywhere. And we began to realize, what? We need some kids, because we got all this love left over. And we need some more folks to give that love to. And then gradually we had another child and we had a third child. Actually, we thought we were done at 2. We built a house. Paula had a problem with one of the rooms, so she asked me to go talk to the architect about the design of the house. And I came and I told him what she wanted. He said we could do that. I came home to Paula and I said, it's all good. And she said, I feel funny. That was our third child. His baby room was the mother-in-law suite. But friends, that is exactly the same dynamic of growth. that visits the Baha'i community. Our first job is just to generate enough love to get feasts together on time and to establish a local spiritual assembly and to have an increasing body of love and unity among the Baha'is themselves. But as we get better and better at that, the Baha'i community will produce more love than it takes to sustain the unity and the harmony of the community itself. And you need to give that love to more people. That's exactly what Baha'i life is about. So when we start talking about happiness and we start talking about generating all this love, let's not think of it in individualistic, self-indulgent terms. Let's think about it as a boon to me and a vehicle of love and service to construct the kingdom for every single soul on the planet, because that's what it's about. And while I'm on it, let me just say one more thing. We think a lot about prayer, and we pray every day. But we don't think as much about meditation. And yet Baha'u'llah very seldom mentions one without mentioning the other. Here's the sense I think that makes, at least in my current understanding. Our lives go faster and faster every day. You know, we got the mom job, we got the dad job, we got the marriage job, we got the parents job, we got the job, we got the Baha'i job, we got a lot of jobs. We got the worried about the direction of our country job, we got the conflict in the streets job, we got lots of jobs. We got the climate change job. Is there going to be any air to breathe, for crying out loud? We got lots of jobs. And what happens is it compels us at a speed and with an intensity that causes us to rivet our focus on the next job we have to do. And it does not give us a chance to breathe, to relax, to reorganize and assess, how do I feel about my life? Am I doing the things that I value the most? Am I expressing love and appreciation to myself, to my spouse, to my children, to my community, Baha'i and larger? That's the work that meditation does. It allows us to set aside the immediate concerns of life and to reflect on our purposes. Now, we've been advised to meditate in a lot of ways. You know, we all know that it involves breathing. We all know that you've got to expand your stomach so that your diaphragm can fill with air. Do it slowly. Put the greatest name in there, all the names of God in one expression. My favorite way to do it is to think about one of the hidden words and just to recite it slowly in my mind. And I find that it takes me to a different place. And in that place, I am, for the moment, relieved of all the jobs I have to do. And I find that when I return from that place, I'm better able to sort through the various priorities in my life and to do them with a refreshed sense of the fundamental purpose of life that animates me in a new way. And I would just ask us to think about meditating, you know, and it doesn't have to be for this amount of time or that amount of time. The truth of the matter is, if I've got the time, then I'll start every morning. You know, in my house, I get up, I make cappuccinos, I bring one to Paula. She seems to like that. I don't know what it is about being served coffee every morning, but it seems to work, and I'm in the business of doing what works. And we'll sit and watch the sun come up over the lake. and imagine that Haifa is just on the other side of Lake Michigan. And read some of the writings and pray and sit there and reflect for a moment. And I love to do it at the break of day because nobody's calling you then. You're not getting emails at that time in the morning. Nobody's texting you. And you just have a chance to settle in and to reaffirm your recognition that Baha'u'llah is your Lord. And we are in his service. And we want this day to be an expression of our faith and to radiate his love to someone else. And somehow, over time, it changes you. And you find yourself feeling different ways, better ways, and not as disturbed by difficulties and tribulations, but seeing them with detachment. And you find yourself thinking about that prayer. You remember that prayer on the very first page of our prayer book, which says, "Intone, O my servants, the verses of God." And then it says that the scattering angels may scatter abroad the fragrances of your prayer. And sooner or later, exercise its influence on the hearts of all souls. And so what I'm wanting to suggest to us is that we're all ordinary people. We've got lots of burdens and issues. But Baha'u'llah has said, ask what ye will of him alone, whatever you need. And that we can reorient our habits of thought, transform our habits of the heart, and reorient our habits of behavior in a way that is consistent with the purpose of our creation and will exercise a transformational influence on the happiness of your own heart. And that heart will produce more love and more happiness than you need. And you'll have some left over, and you'll be able to give it to other people. So somehow, we have to have a routine of maintenance for ourselves so that we protect the expansion of our capacity to understand, to appreciate, to love, to accommodate, so that we begin to experience the growth of patience. We begin to expand the perspective that leads to wisdom. We begin to see things from another person's point of view. And if we do these things, then there is every reason to believe that the natural expression of the feelings that will invade our hearts will be at the service of unity in our communities. And I'm not going to tell you what you need to do, because I'm going to tell you that over the last century, there is no community in this country that has done more on race than we have, in more different ways. So you'll know what to do. But I am going to suggest a couple of things. I'm going to suggest to you that this is a time for devotional meetings. It's a time to have people over to pray for America and to talk about where our country is going. And it's a time for them to bring their Bibles and bring their Qurans, and you bring your prayer book. And let's all pray that God's will be done, by his kingdom come, his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And to have a rich conversation about the condition of our community and the condition of life in our nation. And I will tell you with absolute certainty that they will love it. And you will too. that this is a time to gather children together and talk about who they can be in life. You know, I told you, I was born in the largest geographic ghetto in the continental United States. There were black people for tens of miles and nobody else. We were poor as church mice. I had Levi's because Chandler Lee grew to be 6'9". He was my age, but he was growing faster. So he'd grow out of clothes real quick, and that's why I had clothes. You know, to this day, my big luxury is whole milk because we drank powdered milk whenever we could get it. And anybody who drinks powdered milk knows it's nasty. It is terrible. I mean, it is awful. Ugh. So now the big deal for me is every day I go, you know, and I'm 9 years younger than the century itself, and I still go to the refrigerator, open it up, and see milk, and say, yeah, I got milk. It's right there. We can accomplish this, even though individually we think, who am I? What can I do? The truth is, you are a soul who has the unique privilege of the knowledge of Baha'u'llah. And it is not your power that will transform conditions. It is his power. Remember that Baha'u'llah himself said in a conversation that we were privileged to read, when he confesses his weakness and feebleness as an individual, he said, and when I think of myself as weaker and more feeble than an ant. He said, but when I think of my relationship to you, then I am capable of accomplishing everything. He wasn't speaking solely for himself. He was speaking for us. Now, if I am correct, I have 15 minutes left. I'm looking for somebody in charge. Is that right? Is that right? Okay. All right, so, because I've mentioned a couple of things that were not on my list. You know, shoot me, I got carried away. What can I tell you? So I want to conclude our remarks with proof. I love proof. Because then, you know, we're not talking about, gee, that's a nice idea, but how do you know? So I'm going to tell you a short story, which is perhaps my favorite story. And it is the story of the attempt on the life of the Shah in Iran in 1852. Now, this was a tragedy of immense proportions. His Holiness the Bab, who had been persecuted and imprisoned for most of his dispensation, had been martyred. The Babis were being hunted and tortured, and no sooner had they found the Qaim, they had lost him. And they were driven mad by their loss. This culminated in a deranged Baha'i youth taking a .25 caliber pistol and shooting at the Shah, wounding him in the leg from a distance that was so great it could not possibly have injured him severely. And it is amazing that he even hit the target he was aiming for. But it instantly became an indictment of all of the Babis and galvanized the Shah's kingdom in a pogrom against the Babis, which would ultimately cost 20,000 lives. In torture so great that our writings confess that even the historical accounts are inadequate to describe the tortures that the Babis were put to. Baha'u'llah was at the time visiting dignitaries far from Tehran. And when news came that this had happened, his hosts begged him to stay under their protection. He, of course, mounted his horse and rode to the army base to submit himself as a Babi. Although he had done nothing and had no knowledge or participation in any of this, this was the individual act of a deranged human being. And he was, of course, tortured and placed in the Siyachal, the black pit, which had been a water reservoir. A very steep and dark decline of stairs into a black pit which had been filled with water as a water source for the city. So you can imagine the mold, the slime, the smell, the disease, the pestilence that was in that pit. And Baha'u'llah says that day and night, while confined in that dungeon, we meditated upon the deeds, the condition, and the conduct of the Babis, wondering what could have led a people so high-minded, so noble, and of such intelligence to perpetuate such an outrageous and audacious act against the person of His Majesty. Now, Shoghi Effendi explains this, and he says that in explaining the historical significance of this, he is also setting an expectation for all of us to understand how growth occurs in the cause of God. And he says that it occurs through this interplay of crisis and victory. And he says that from time to time, these inexplicable events will occur. And they will cast a shadow on the great name of the faith. They will arrest its forward progress and paralyze its community. Now, these are not mild words. Arrest its forward progress and paralyze the community. He said, however, in the course of time, viewed in its proper perspective, the events that occurred will be viewed as a blessing in disguise. And he goes on to explain the specific benefits. He said that these events, now remember, he's talking about this horrendous assault on the king, and he's talking about the resulting persecution of all of the Babis, including the lives of tens of thousands of Babis who were taken as a result. He says that it is a providential means for a fresh outpouring of celestial grace. He says it is a means for the fulfillment of age-old spiritual prophecies. He says that it is a stimulant to the galvanization and revitalization of the community of the faithful. And he says often at the height of these crises, more often when the crises have passed, the wisdom of what has occurred will be evident to both friend and foe. I think of this as a great lesson, not simply in the context of Baha'i history, but as a way of understanding what humanity is enduring and what the faith itself is going through, so that we can understand how the cause of God operates, and we can understand that we are never alone, we are never abandoned, we are never without the assistance and guidance of Baha'u'llah through all this thorny and tortuous path we have chosen to walk. So as you know, Baha'u'llah was banished to Baghdad. He had a torturous trip, which was undertaken in the midst of winter with inadequate provisions and inadequate clothing and warmth. And when he got to Baghdad, he went on retreat for a period of about 2 years in Sulaymaniyah. And by the time he returned, the Bahá'í community was in complete chaos. There were pretenders to leadership, there was anarchy among the Baha'is, there was very little understanding of the true meaning of the Bab's faith, and just a kind of demented, passionate commitment that had no faithful expression. And the Baha'is had become degraded by Baha'u'llah's own view. They had become the worst members of Iranian society, as they had been the best. And Baha'u'llah then began to reveal a series of tablets, then nominally as a Baha'i, because although he had received revelation by that time, it was not public, as you will recall. And in these tablets, he began to explain the true meaning of the teachings of the Bab and its relationship to politics, its relationship to secrecy, its relationship to service, the implications for international relations, the implications for women and for the eradication of poverty and for replacing enmity with love, and so on. And this copious rain, as Baha'u'llah described it himself, began to cleanse the souls of the Baha'is, and they became the most distinguished and honored members of Iranian society at that time. Now, this was a period of about 10 years, and this was all preliminary to the public announcement of Baha'u'llah's station as him whom God will make manifest. But you see this incredibly intense arc of historical progress, from the attempt on the life of the Shah, the degradation and persecution of the Baha'is, the seclusion of Baha'u'llah, the return of Baha'u'llah, the copious rain of tablets that he revealed to help the Baha'is understand the true meaning of the Bab's faith and the transformational influence those tablets had on the spiritual condition of the Baha'is, elevating their social prominence and causing them to be regarded as the most fair-minded, the most trustworthy, the most honorable people in the country. Now, years and years later, decades later, in the 20th century, the persecution of the Iranian Baha'is was renewed in the late 30s. And once again, the beleaguered community of Iran was subject to a torrent of persecutions as the whipping boys for some other political issues. The Iranian Baha'is wrote Shoghi Effendi saying, "Why again? What is happening?" And Shoghi Effendi wrote them a letter at Rizvan in 1938 to put into perspective what was happening to them and what their sacrifices were generating for others. And he said it was the shedding of the sacred blood of the martyrs in Persia which built the temple in Wilmette. He said it was the shedding of the sacred blood of the martyrs in Persia which caused the American government to recognize legally the status of the faith as an independent religion and to recognize the National Spiritual Assembly as its national governing body. He said it was the shedding of the sacred blood of the martyrs in Persia which had galvanized the firmness of the covenant of the European and American Baha'is. He said it was the shedding of the sacred blood of the martyrs in Persia which had laid the foundation for the spiritual conquest of the planet and the eventual establishment of the oneness of all humankind. And what I would say to you is what Shoghi Effendi said to all of us, that our task is not by their death, but by living sacrifice. We must contribute our share and play our part in the transformation of this world into the kingdom of heaven on earth. And so, friends, what I want to leave you with is this idea. We've all come to Green Lake, and we have richly enjoyed our fellowship with one another. We have heard and sung heavenly music and felt ourselves to be in an ideal embrace of love. And friends, what I would suggest to us is that we consider what we can do to help everybody everywhere feel just like we feel right now. Thank you so much.